Hello, welcome back to Sociological Theory. Today I want to talk with you about one of the biggest names in sociological theory, someone who's been claimed as um, an economist, a philosopher, a political scientist, and a sociologist, Karl Marx. Marx was a very, very large figure in the 1800s, late 1800s, and very much so into the 1900s as his work began to emphasize political changes that then different totalitarian regimes took on, such as the Soviet Union. Marx would have been appalled by the use of his ideas in the name of countries like the Soviet Union and what they ended up doing. But nevertheless, his theories and ideas have influenced millions and millions of people, so a very prominent figure to reckon with. The background of his life, he was German and he descended from rabbis. His father converted to Protestantism and did so in order to facilitate his career, to avoid the discrimination related to Judaism. His mother was from the Netherlands, and she came from wealth. When Marx was a young man, his father wanted him to study law and very much promoted this agenda. Marx was not so thrilled about it. Marx seemed to be a fellow of many talents, and he liked studying many different things. When he was first at the university in Bonn, he was a bit of a party boy, apparently. He would sometimes get into duels, drinking, things such as this. Eventually, his father died, and that allowed Marx to branch out into something different, to study philosophy. And he eventually graduated from the University of Berlin. When he did graduate, though, he had trouble getting an academic position, and so he became a journalist. And he wrote many newspaper articles, but ultimately had trouble maintaining jobs as a journalist and saw his articles frequently censored because they were somewhat controversial. And so at one point he, I believe, was even deported from Germany. And this caused him to have to move around quite a bit. So he went to Brussels, he lived in Paris for a while, Germany again, and eventually in 1848 was associated with revolutions that were occurring in Paris and Germany. Unlike Herbert Spencer, the social theorist we discussed who came before Marx, Marx was German, and on the continent, the experience of capitalism and the revolutions that were occurring in relation to this changing economic system were quite dramatic and strong reactions. Spencer really theorized a very stable society in part because he was from England, and that was a fairly stable transition into the industrial era. Marx in Germany did not see that as much, and his experience was much more a dramatic shift of the wealthy and the poor and the rights of workers needing to coalesce in order to have a better life. So he was associated with these revolutions in Paris and Germany in 1848, a very pivotal time in history. He also worked, as I have outlined, for and with the First International Workers Movement for 10 years. So he was actively involved in trying to help workers with the cause of workers and unions. He eventually participated in the Paris Commune of 1871, which turned out to be a very tragic thing because 30,000 workers were massacred. If you could imagine the entire population of Kearney, Nebraska killed, that is quite a stunning, horrific thing. Workers who were trying to ascertain their rights. He then was exiled to England and he lived the rest of his life in England, and he ended up living much of his life in poverty, though toward the end he was able to get an inheritance. He was often dependent on his close friend and co-author Friedrich Engels for financial assistance. And Engels, in fact, assisted Marx in many ways. When Marx had an illegitimate child with a housekeeper, Engels supported that child. So they had more than just a bond of authors, co-authors on many works. Marx had several children during his lifetime, but nearly all of them died before he did, and Marx suffered from boils and skin disorders, and died in 1883 in England. His theories really focus on the importance of a new kind of economic form, capitalism. In a previous discussion, I talked to you about the difference between the traditional period and the modern period. The traditional period, I said, was characterized by the economic system of feudalism. In feudalism, you had nobility, landowners, and you had serfs. And there was basically a traditional relationship with those two parties. In a way, you could almost describe it as like a familial relationship, because it was traditional and it was handed down from generation to generation. You could not buy or sell land in the feudal era. You only inherited it. And what happened when there was this move toward capitalism is the serfs maintained or I should say they acquired their freedom. They were able to leave the property and able to enter into free will contracts with different people for work. So capitalism really involves the ability to purchase and sell anything. The assumption is free markets driven by the profit motive. And as I mentioned before, the dramatic shift between the types of lives and the way lives were organized pre-1600 in the traditional period and the way that they came to be organized after the Enlightenment with the birth of the modern era, that was a revolutionary change. It was very difficult for people. And so Marx, I would like you to know, focuses strongly on the economic element of this change and how that affected people. A crucial term to know about in relation to Marx is his notion of species being. In some ways, this is really grounding a lot of what he has to say. And what is this idea? It's that humans are very unique as a species. We're different from other animals, like, for example, zebras, lions, monkeys. These animals are part of a naturally occurring world. Humans, on the other hand, are able to make their own environments, and we do not have to be slaves to our immediate needs. We can come up with creative solutions to meet those needs. And so, for Marx, our whole experience as humans is rooted in material life and the way that we manage our material life. Our ability to make things is the way we express our unique nature, our fundamental difference from other species. And from that, we can define a host of different terms. Alienation, which we'll talk about in a future slide, is basically the idea of being separate from something. Ideology is a set of ideas or beliefs. False consciousness is the idea that you are perceiving the world in a way that is actually different from how it truly is. And Marx also discussed this notion of class consciousness, which is what he thought the proletariat, or the workers within a society, needed in order to bond together to eliminate false consciousness, which was the dominant ideology of the capitalists, and that class consciousness would allow for revolution, would allow for the possibility of social change. Marx drew from philosophers, and he was part of a group called the Young Hegelians, and these were followers of a philosopher named Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And Hegel created what he called the material dialectic approach to history. A dialectic has these three components: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So what you would begin with is a thesis, and then there's something which is its natural opposite, the antithesis. And those two are fundamentally unstable. Those opposites are in fundamental tension, and they have to resolve themselves. And so they do resolve themselves into a synthesis. This was a process that Marx took as a general idea from Hegel. Hegel, though, was rooted in an idealistic view. He believed that ideas came first, and then we perceived our material world. Marx believed that the material world came first, and then our ideas grew from those. All right. So as I've described that material dialectic approach, there's a tension of opposites. It then resolves itself into the synthesis. And then what happens is the synthesis ends up having its own opposite, and that has to resolve itself. So this is a conception of history as an ongoing process. And that is something where I've tried to give an example, and perhaps you know about it. In Grand Island, there is a shop in one of the malls, and it's called Hot Topic. And if you've ever been in this store, it's in some ways really drawing from the punk movement. And the punk movement was a movement in the 1970s that started in England with working class youths who were kept out of work. They had very high unemployment rates. And those young people said, we don't like this. We're going to create our own alternative culture criticizing this in the face of this. And so they started to do things like combine very strange different forms of clothing that didn't seem to belong together. They would pin a safety pin through their cheek. They would have mohawk hair with airplane glue. And they were doing a lot of things that were wild and crazy fashion, music, etc. What ended up happening was that punk rock became so fashionable that capitalists ended up saying, hey, wait a minute, we can reappropriate this as a form of fashion. We can market it and sell it to other people besides these rebellious kids. And so that's where stores like Hot Topic came from. And so this I like to think of as an example of thesis, which would be, this idea of punk rock, its criticism of capitalist structures. The antithesis, which would be capitalist itself, and then it forms into this synthesis, which is this bizarre commodification, or the turning into products of punk ideology. So that is one way perhaps of thinking about how this dialectic process works. Marx believed that there was going to be a historical progression. First, capitalism. And there's this belief that Marx hated capitalism, and nothing could be further from the truth. He saw it as a necessary period in human history. It was very important because it has allowed us to mass produce goods, to create a system where we as humans will have more than enough stuff to support ourselves, to provide for our species. So capitalism and the process of industrial production for Marx was a good thing. However, he saw it as just simply a stage within human evolution, the evolution of economic systems and humanity. After capitalism, we should be smart enough, Marx believed, to be able to share the wealth of all the resources capitalism generates. And so he believed that next would follow socialism, which you could argue is something like the governmental distribution of goods and services based on need. to more of a communist system, which would in principle be the sharing of everything. One of the concepts to know about with Marx, it's crucial, it's the idea of the means of production. Now, what are these means of production? Basically, anything that a capitalist uses in order to make things. So, for example, if you want to create an iPhone, you would need certain kinds of tools, you would need certain raw material, you would need factories in order to accomplish that goal. The means of production is what the bourgeoisie have that the proletariat then use and do work with in order to make material goods. Marx thought that the contradictions inherent in capitalism would eventually lead to its overthrow. And what were those conflicts? Well, for capitalists, the main motivating goal is profit. And capitalism, in a very simplified way, can be reduced to a two-class system. You have the proletariat, which is a French word for the working class. Then you also have the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, as I mentioned in the previous slide, they're the owners of the means of production. And so this is a system where there's an inherent tension between the interests of the proletariat, those workers, and the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production. There's a tension because this system is rooted in exploitation. The idea that, for example, in feudal societies, there was exploitation, that is true. But there also seemed to be a very clear kind of relationship, which again had some characteristics of like a family and a caring between those two groups. Also, too, serfs would have perhaps a small percentage of their property that they had control over, that they would be able to grow some of their own crop. And so the type of exploitation was not as dramatic, Marx would probably argue, as you saw with the development of capitalism. Now, Marx said that those in the proletariat are going to suffer from alienation. And if you've ever worked in fast food, you can think for a second about how that went, what that was like. Probably you didn't have a lot of say-so in the type of products that you made. You probably had to wear a uniform. You probably had to work with people who you didn't necessarily like. You also even might have had to change your language. Welcome to so-and-so. May I take your order, please? Would you like that to be supersized? Do you want fries with that? There's a whole way of controlling so much of who you are as a person. And so in part, alienation, which again is another word you could say for separation, workers experience alienation, because they cannot control their labor. So workers are seen as like cogs in a machine for Marx. And if an employer could eliminate a worker and replace a worker with a machine that would be cheaper, a capitalist certainly would. A member of the bourgeoisie certainly would do that. But when they cannot do that, they have to hire workers. And this allowed Marx to theorize different types of alienation, 4 types in particular. First, when you worked at a fast food place, or if you didn't, maybe to imagine it, you probably don't feel a lot of connection with the product. That's the result of your labor. In part because you're just one part of a process. If you work on an assembly line, maybe you screw in the bolt over and over again on a car, you don't necessarily feel a strong, warm connection with that final product. Not in the same way that people, for example, who worked in guilds in the 1600s and in the Middle Ages in Europe did. They might work very hard on producing a product themselves and then also trade that, barter that for something that someone else had produced by hand. And so people had a much stronger emotional connection with the things they produced. Not so in capitalism. Workers also experience alienation from themselves, himself, if you would excuse Marx, through the act of production. So you probably worked at a job where you don't really feel like you are mentally there. You, and as one of my friends says, you check out mentally from your job. And that means that in some ways a deadly dull drudgery of factory work, and many other types of work, frankly, can cause you to be alienated from yourself. You're alienated from your species being, in Marx's ideas as well, because you're separated from the very thing that makes you unique as a species, what makes you human, creative participation in labor to do the things that you're fully capable of doing. When I was a kid, there was an ad campaign which was put on by the United Negro College Fund, and it had showed a classroom, and there were many kids in the classroom except for one desk that was empty. And the catch line at the end was, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." And really, in some ways, that could relate to Marx, because what he's saying is if you are working in a factory and you are just a cog in a machine, you really are not fulfilling your full potential as a human being. Your mind is being wasted. And what an awful, awful thing that is, to imagine the millions of people in China and around the world who have the full potential of humanity, but cannot realize that potential because they're trapped in factory work in miserable conditions where they have to work every day just to meet their own material survival needs. Marx saw that as a very important form of alienation. Finally, also you could say you're alienated from other people, from other humans in this process. You don't necessarily feel a very warm connection with your boss who has you in this situation. You don't feel a warm connection with those people you work with because they're also alienated. It's just not a very healthy system, at least for Marx. He stressed a need, therefore, for class consciousness. Two classes needed to emerge, and in particular the proletariat needed to see their own interests and form together to say, look, we want this system changed. It's oppressive and it is hurting us. It's also hurting all of humanity. And so if Marx thought that if the class of the proletariat did not unite, then there would be maybe a fragmentation of interests. In part, Marx probably wanted to see a type of society where it wasn't just people who were living and had an identity as part of a nation or one sex or another. I think for Marx, he wanted to somehow have all of us find our common humanity. And in order to get there, he thought class consciousness was the way. That was the way this change would occur. Capitalism is defined by free market enterprise and the ability for people to voluntarily enter into contracts with each other. The big goal of the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, is profit. And that, Marx believed, would mean that markets would need to continually expand in order to find more money, to find audiences, or I should say consumers, willing to purchase new goods and services. And so this idea that capitalism requires expanding markets. If you want to think about this, when I was a kid, for example, we had cassette tapes and records and 8-tracks. That was the main form by which recorded music was distributed. Those were all things that I had growing up. And a lot of those technologies were deemed sort of like replaceable, that there were better forms of listening to music and recording music. So eventually, CDs began to replace cassettes and records and 8-tracks as the preferred way of having recorded music. And that meant that a new market was created. All those people who had records, who had tapes and CDs, or I'm sorry, records, tapes, 8-tracks, then needed to get rid of those machines, get rid of those items, and buy new forms that met up with the new formats, the new machines that would play those types of CDs. Then, of course, what's happened after that? You have MP3 players and iPods have come about. And so again, there was a move toward a new technology, which meant that the platform shifted. All the other stuff in certain respects was made redundant and worthless. And you have a new market that develops a new way to sell products. And that's something Marx thought was a crucial aspect of capitalism. One of the other things he argued was that in contemporary society, money becomes universal. A universal means that it exists across different spheres. And so, to some extent, you could say that money really becomes the common denominator of human relationships. And what does that mean? It means that in principle, capitalism means the ability to buy and sell anything. So what you end up seeing is people say, well, you can't buy or sell anything. For example, prostitution is illegal. But that's only because the state makes it illegal. The practice still occurs. And there are a lot of other things that are maybe unsavory for us to think about, but they still get sold, bought and sold, commodified, if you will. That's the next term. For example, human organs. There are black markets where people can buy and sell human organs if they need them. So this becomes a common denominator of all kinds of relationships. If I want to get some type of work done, I pay someone to do it. My worth in the world, in some respects, is determined by the type of job that I do. I can pay people to do all kinds of things. If I want to clean my house, to fix my car, to educate my nephews. This is the way in which we all interact and the thing through which we all interact. And Marx did not think that was very good. He was strongly critiquing that idea. I just mentioned commodification, which is really everything that is possible to buy and sell. And things within our human life world become stuff that can be bought and sold. So, for example, all kinds of services. You can buy people who will listen to you, talk about your problems. They're called counselors. You can buy the time of the people who will help you to exercise, work out, train, personal trainers. The thing about our world today is it seems like so many things have been commodified, including odd things like images. So, for example, branding has become a very important thing, and it changes the seeming worth of an object. So, for example, a shirt with a Nike logo on it somehow becomes worth more than, for example, a plain t-shirt. So commodification and the way that commodification has changed, especially today, probably would have fascinated Marx and would have found it really interesting. And that relates to this idea of human beings being able to create new needs where there weren't needs before. You have a cell phone, likely. You probably would feel pretty strongly that you need that cell phone, and you would feel bad if you were deprived of it. So what happens then is commodities proliferate. Eventually your cell phone will be out of date, or the model will not suit your needs anymore. Maybe it doesn't have a camera, or it doesn't have the ability to surf the web. So that means that new commodities need to be made. And what we end up with is overproduction. We have more junk today, more stuff that's been produced than ever before in human history. Our landfills are a testament to the amount of stuff that we make, that we dispose of and throw away. One great example of this process of overproduction is at the middle of a Super Bowl game, there will be t-shirts that they're going to get ready to sell. And as soon as the game is over, you'll see ads at the very end which will say, you can buy these t-shirts or winning footballs, various things, which have the name of the team on them and the Super Bowl champion logo that these people won. Now, in order for that to be possible to buy instantly, right after the game, you know that they have to create 2 sets of these. Depending on who's going to win, that's the logo and the merchandise they're going to sell. So in other words, they've created tens of thousands of t-shirts, balls, whatever, with the wrong logo that would then have to be destroyed after that event. So we have a massive overproduction, and it's really part and parcel with our capitalist everyday life. You have more clothes, probably, than most people would have had in their lifetime 100 years ago. So these are fascinating things to consider, and how those things affect, for example, our natural environment, the amount of waste that we create. Marx also importantly differentiated between use value and exchange value. Use value, simple terms, is the being able to make something. I'm sorry, let me try that again. Use value is what you can do with something. So it says the function that a product contains. For example, if you have a can opener, you can use it to open cans. The exchange value, on the other hand, is different. The exchange value is what is it that this can be exchanged for. So there's a fundamental difference between those two things. Use, really, you could think of as more related to any species, would try to make use out of things. Otters, for example, would take a rock and bang open a shellfish in order to eat that shellfish. So some animals can use tools. Exchange value, though, trading, is something we are unique at. And the value of things in trade is a socially determined value. Now next, that leads us to surplus value, which is the idea of, simply put, unpaid labor. Let's say that you work for $10 an hour, and you, in that 1 hour that you're paid to work, you make a product that is worth $100, okay? The surplus value of that product that you've made is $90. And so what's happened is that labor has been added to the value of a product that has not been paid for. You did not receive the extra $90. The capitalist took that as his or her profit. And so Marx saw surplus value as, in some ways, the mechanism through which the exploitation and oppression of the proletariat continues. This is, some people would argue, maybe a necessary part of capitalism. For example, could you think, for example, of why a capitalist might say they need to make profit? Perhaps they can say, well, I arranged for this system where this object was to be produced, so as someone who created this situation, I deserve some money for that. They could also say that they have the material that was needed in order to do it. So again, this wouldn't have been produced without them. And they can also say, and this is an interesting thing again, capitalism assumes free markets. So if you don't like the fact that you were paid $10 to make a product worth $100, well, that's too bad. You're welcome to go somewhere else and do that work. If you can get paid more, good for you. That's fine. So this is, again, a crucial concept for Marx. And finally, on this slide, commodity fetishism. And fetishism you can define as a kind of a love for an object, a love for a single thing. And this is something maybe you've experienced in your own life where you've looked at some type of product and you've kind of salivated over it. You've thought, oh gosh, there's this new, I don't know, game system or this new phone or something, this new car. And man, once I get this, that will really change things. Wow, that will make me very happy. And what's been found is that, in fact, it does make you happy for a little while. But then that need is not fulfilled. There's a new need to go to the market again to get something else which you believe will be something that will fulfill you more and make you happy. So commodity fetishism is becoming infatuated with products. And these are ultimately all around us, the products that we make. And they seem to us to be alien products. It's as if we didn't make them. They take on a special status. So we desire these products, then we get them, and you've probably experienced this too, this kind of like a depression a few days later where you realize, oh, I spent all this money and this hasn't really changed my world incredibly. You feel empty afterwards. What is reification? This is a useful term as well. Reification is the idea of an idea being treated as a thing. So something that's mental or abstract, or something that humans create as being something that cannot be changed. So reification, for example, if you are in a particular social system, we often come to see those systems as natural and taken for granted. And we reify the system and say that, oh, it exists and it's real and we can't do anything about it. Marx would say, well, that's a form of false consciousness. That is not going to allow for you to see that that is not a real thing, that it actually can be changed. So human beings engage in reification with fair regularity. Marx saw this as part of ideology. And you could talk about the idea of dominant ideology. Ideology, books have been written about ideology, but if we want to simplify it, it's just an organized collection of ideas. That's an ideology. So there are dominant ideologies in our society. These allow for statements that we make about the world, and those can promote a subtle bias, even though they presumably seem neutral. So in capitalism, the ruling class is really the source of this dominant ideology, a set of ideas and beliefs about the world and how the world should be, that ultimately you are born into and you end up taking as, again, something that's natural and taken for granted. A great example of this is the idea of private property, that we are all born into a system which basically says private property is real. Private property, in point of fact, is a human idea or notion. There's nothing inherent about how a person should be able to own or possess something. If you think about, for example, Native Americans, when they saw whites coming and claiming the land in what came to be the United States, there are famous quotes that would say, you cannot own the sky, you cannot own the land. And the idea that humans can is to some extent ridiculous. So this is, in some ways, not the best way I can think of explaining ideology. So we have, for our dominant ideology, we have the creation of law, which protects private property. So we've created these human-based systems to make these things seem real. And Marx, again, I mentioned, believes that all human relationships are rooted in materialism, in the way in which we produce our material world. And he called that really the base the way that we produce our material world, the means of production, he argued that that creates what you could call the superstructure or culture. So, unlike Hegel, Marx thought materialism comes first, the material world, and then from that we derive all our ideas, impressions, thoughts, beliefs, and our culture, which is making sense of the world. All right. So, filling this out a little more, the ruling class will always end up controlling dominant ideology, promoting ideas that are in their interests. Things like, for example, property is good, and we should all try to attain property. You need property in order to live, and property is a scarce resource. So these ideas, for Marx, create a sense of false consciousness among workers. So what happens in many instances, if people see, for example, homeless people, they might say, while those people are lazy, crazy, or stupid, they need to get a job. They're not contributing to society, and that promotes ideas like, I don't want to be homeless. I should work harder. And I've had friends who've said this. When they've had a lot of medical bills or something that's happened, there's this ideology in the United States of extreme individualism and extreme individual responsibility, where if you fail, it's on you. And there's another term that isn't on the slides, but it's meritocracy. Meritocracy is the belief in a system based on merit. You earn what you get. This is also very popular in our country, in the United States, as a way of explaining why some people fail and other people have succeeded. It promotes a kind of almost a moral justification for why people succeed. So we buy into ideas like I should work harder, instead of saying, hey, we're all oppressed here, we're all proletariat in this environment, maybe we ought to change this system and get rid of it and distribute things equally and fairly so that we all have a chance to have our full species being. So there you see Marx, and in some ways a very utopian vision of the world, this idea that we can change a system that we've created which oppresses people. His famous false consciousness example that's in your text is this idea of religion is the opium of the people. Opium, of course, is a drug, a very powerful intoxicant. And religion, he believed, you could see as part of the dominant ideology, that it promotes ideas like, for example, maybe you're familiar with the phrase, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. That those people who are oppressed in this world, who are having trouble and are poor in this world, well, in the next world, in heaven or wherever, they will receive their reward. So that allows for a system of exploitation to continue without being overthrown, without revolution. Now, Marx, I should clarify, he did not want to take away the idea of God from people who look to God for spiritual solace. He wanted to say, how could this system be used in a way that harms people and reproduces a system that works against some? So what's going to change all of these problems in the system of capitalism? If there's class consciousness. If, as I have here, his famous last words in the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite. Again, workers of the world coming together, irrespective of national differences, religious differences, age differences, whatever. Those workers have to come together for the common cause of a proletariat revolution to allow humans to become all that they can become. Class consciousness, though, is going to be hard to achieve because the state, the government, produces ideology, a dominant ideology. And that's how that dominant culture retains their dominance. Those who make the system are able to perpetuate the system. And what ultimately you could say is that laborers buy into systems that are not in their interests, that hurt them. Sometimes this idea has been appropriated by others who are part of a critical thinking tradition, more of a conflict tradition in sociology. So, for example, feminists have said that really wearing high heels, for example, is false consciousness. It's this idea that, oh, I should buy shoes that make my body look a certain way, that make me look pretty, and this is in my interest. Feminists might say, well, actually, if you look at it from a more critical perspective, those are shoes that basically inhibit your ability to walk. They harm your feet, and they're designed to make you look appealing to men. So this isn't in your interest. So that you could think of as maybe another way of thinking about ideology, false consciousness, and the idea of maybe class consciousness in order to overcome some type of shared oppression. People tend to buy into systems that hurt them sometimes. That's, for example, maybe an argument about homelessness in the United States. People will say, well, those people should stop being lazy and get a job. Well, arguably, there are a lot of people who become homeless who it has nothing to do with laziness. But by promoting that belief, there's also a belief that these people are parasites on a system, that they harm us and that they need to be dealt with in very harsh ways. Marx believed that this class consciousness is really the way to change that oppressive system, again, through revolution. And as I said before, a united front to make this historical change. How can we critique Marxist theory? One important thing to consider, he was very thorough about analyzing capitalism. He wrote a 1,000-page book in his lifetime on capital, history of capital. In fact, in his lifetime, he wrote volumes and volumes of work, so many works. He's one of the most prolific social theorists. However, he did not spend much time describing in detail how a socialist and or a communist system would work. So he focused a lot on the criticism, but as far as the fine details, the mechanisms of the answer and what it would be like once this revolution occurred, that was not fleshed out. The second criticism of Marx was that he believed in the historic inevitability of capitalism's demise, and that it would be overcome, creating a socialist, communist-based system. And for better or worse, that has not happened. So Marx, his ideas were, again, as I said at the beginning of these slides, his ideas were taken on by many, many people through authoritarian, totalitarian regimes, such as the Stalinist regime, and resulting in some horrific consequences that Marx himself would have deplored. At one point in his life, Marx saw what some of his ideas were being taken up to advocate for, and he said, "I am not a Marxist," famously. And so Marx leaves us with a fascinating way of thinking about how sometimes the ideas that people promote get changed and mutated even though they are in the name of the person who created those ideas.